February 18, 2001. Daytona International Speedway. The final lap of the most famous race in NASCAR history. 3 cars were fighting for position as they roared through the final turn. Then, in an instant, everything changed. Car number 3, the black Chevrolet with the iconic white number, drifted up the track and slammed into the outside retaining wall. The crash didn't look catastrophic, not compared to the ones fans had seen 100 times before. But Dale Earnhardt Sr. never got out of that car. One of the most beloved, most feared, and most celebrated drivers in the history of motorsport was gone. He was 49 years old. In the days and weeks that followed, the world mourned. Tributes poured in from every corner of racing. Fans left flowers, hats, t-shirts, and handwritten notes outside Daytona and at tracks across the country. But behind the grief, behind the public outpourings of love, there were serious questions. How does a driver who had survived decades of high-speed racing, who had walked away from crashes that looked far worse, die in what appeared to be a relatively straightforward impact? The autopsy report, along with the investigation that followed, would answer some of those questions. But the answers it gave were painful, complicated, and in some ways, deeply sad. Today, we're going to walk through what the official autopsy revealed, what the investigation uncovered, and why Dale Earnhardt's death ended up changing NASCAR and motorsport safety forever. This is not just a story about a crash. It's a story about a man, a sport, and a moment that reshaped everything. Before we get into the details of that day, we need to understand who Dale Earnhardt really was, because the weight of what happened is impossible to appreciate without knowing the kind of man he was and what he meant to the sport. Dale Earnhardt was born on April 29, 1951, in Kannapolis, North Carolina. He grew up in a racing family. His father, Ralph Earnhardt, was a respected dirt track driver who taught his son everything he knew about competition, cars, and survival on the track. Dale didn't have an easy childhood. His family didn't have much money, and Dale dropped out of school in the 9th grade to work on cars full-time. He was single-minded, driven in a way that went far beyond just ambition. Racing wasn't something Dale chose, it was who he was. He made his Cup Series debut in 1975, but it wasn't until the early 1980s that he truly became a force in NASCAR. What followed was one of the most dominant careers in the sport's history. 7 Winston Cup championships, matching Richard Petty's all-time record. 76 career wins. A driving style so aggressive, so relentless, that fans and competitors gave him a nickname that said everything, the Intimidator. Earnhardt wasn't just fast. He was calculating. He could read a race the way a chess grandmaster reads a board, and he had a physical confidence on the track that bordered on fearlessness. He had survived some terrifying crashes over the years, broken collarbones, a broken sternum, concussions, and he had always come back. That resilience became part of his legend. People believed, on some level, that Dale Earnhardt was simply too tough to die in a race car. That belief made the events of February 18, 2001, all the more shocking. The 2001 Daytona 500 was shaping up to be a memorable race for the Earnhardt family. Dale Jr. was competing. Michael Waltrip, a close friend driving for Earnhardt's own team, was out front and running well. As the race entered its final laps, Dale Sr. was running in 3rd place, not where the Intimidator wanted to finish, but not a bad position either. He seemed to be doing what many believed he was intentionally doing, using his car to block other drivers from getting past his teammates. On the final lap, coming out of turn 4, a minor contact between Sterling Marlin's car and the rear of Earnhardt's number 3 caused the back end to step out. The car turned slightly to the right and hit the outside concrete wall nearly head-on. The impact was hard, estimated at around 150 miles per hour, but it was not, by the standards of NASCAR racing, a catastrophic-looking wreck. Other cars that day had hit walls harder, and the drivers had walked away. But Dale Earnhardt did not walk away. Emergency crews reached the car almost immediately. When they arrived, they found Earnhardt unresponsive. He was rushed to Halifax Medical Center in Daytona Beach, but there was nothing that could be done. He was pronounced dead at 5:16 p.m. The cause, they would soon discover, was a basilar skull fracture, a break at the base of the skull where it meets the top of the spine. The official autopsy was conducted by Dr. Stephen Bohannon, the medical examiner for Volusia County. The findings were released shortly after the crash, and while the family and NASCAR initially pushed back on certain details becoming public, particularly the release of photographs, the core medical findings were eventually made known. The autopsy confirmed what the initial medical assessment had suggested: Dale Earnhardt died from a basilar skull fracture. This is one of the most severe types of head injuries a person can sustain. The base of the skull, where the brain connects to the spinal cord, fractured on impact. This type of injury causes immediate and catastrophic disruption to the most basic functions of the brain: breathing, heart rate, consciousness. In most cases, it is unsurvivable. Death can occur within seconds. What made this finding so important, and so troubling, was the nature of the crash that caused it. The impact forces in Earnhardt's crash, while significant, were not dramatically higher than impacts that other drivers had survived. The question investigators and engineers had to wrestle with was this: why did this crash kill when so many others had not? Part of the answer came down to the specific mechanics of the collision. When Earnhardt's car hit the wall, the impact was almost perfectly aligned to transfer force directly up through the driver's seat, through his body, and into the base of his skull. His head snapped sharply and violently, likely forward and down, against the steering column or some interior part of the cockpit. It was the direction and concentration of force, not just the raw energy of the crash, that proved fatal. The autopsy also noted other injuries consistent with a high-speed impact, including chest trauma and bruising. But these were secondary. The skull fracture was what killed him, and it killed him almost instantly. One of the most debated and emotionally charged aspects of the investigation was the condition of Earnhardt's safety belt. In the aftermath of the crash, it was discovered that the lap belt, the lower portion of the restraint system, had separated. The question of whether this separation contributed to his death became intensely controversial. NASCAR's own investigation concluded that the belt had broken either during or just after the crash, likely due to the extreme forces involved. The belt was inspected by multiple experts, and there was significant debate about whether it had failed before the fatal head movement occurred, or whether the head injury had already happened before the belt gave way. The manufacturer of the belt, Bill Simpson, a pioneer in motorsports safety equipment, publicly stated that the belt appeared to have been improperly installed or worn. Simpson's company was later named in lawsuits related to Earnhardt's death. Simpson himself was ultimately vindicated after investigations pointed to other factors, but the controversy was damaging. What the experts largely agreed on was this: even if the belt had held perfectly, it may not have prevented the fatal head injury. The basilar skull fracture was the result of head movement, and at the time of Earnhardt's death, the safety systems designed to limit that specific type of movement, particularly a device called the HANS device, were available but not required by NASCAR. That fact, more than almost anything else in the autopsy report and subsequent investigation, became the most painful detail of all. The HANS device, which stands for Head and Neck Support, is a collar and tether system that a driver wears attached to their helmet and harness. Its purpose is to limit the forward and downward snapping motion of the head during a frontal impact. It was designed specifically to prevent the kind of basilar skull fracture that killed Dale Earnhardt. The device had existed since the 1980s. It was developed by biomechanical engineer Dr. Robert Hubbard and his brother-in-law, racing driver Jim Downing. By the time of Earnhardt's death, several drivers in NASCAR and other racing series were already using it voluntarily. The biomechanical case for its effectiveness was well established. But Dale Earnhardt did not wear one. And at the time of his death, NASCAR did not require it. Why didn't Earnhardt wear it? This is one of the sadder footnotes of the whole story. Earnhardt was reportedly uncomfortable with the device. He was a man who trusted his instincts and his physical feel for the car, and some drivers of that era felt that the HANS device was restrictive, that it limited their ability to look around the track quickly, to feel the car through their neck and upper body. This wasn't an unusual concern among drivers at the time. Many resisted it. In the wake of Earnhardt's death, NASCAR moved with unusual speed. Within 2 years, the hands device, or an equivalent head and neck restraint, was mandatory for all NASCAR competitors at every level. Today, it is standard equipment not just in NASCAR but in virtually every major form of motorsport in the world. Biomechanical experts credit the device with saving numerous lives since its widespread adoption. The autopsy report, in revealing the specific nature of Earnhardt's fatal injury, made the connection to the hands device impossible to ignore. It was not just a medical finding, it was a call to action that the sport finally heeded. What many people don't realize is that Dale Earnhardt's death did not occur in isolation. In the years leading up to the 2001 Daytona 500, NASCAR had suffered a series of fatalities that followed a disturbing pattern. Several drivers had died from basilar skull fractures in crashes that, like Earnhardt's, did not appear on the surface to be survival incompatible. In 2000, Adam Petty, the 19-year-old grandson of Richard Petty, died from a basilar skull fracture during a practice session at New Hampshire Motor Speedway. Just weeks later, Kenny Irwin Jr. died from the same type of injury at the same track. In 2001, just weeks before Earnhardt's death at Daytona, Tony Roper had died from a similar injury in a NASCAR Craftsman Truck Series race. Each of these deaths should have been, and in retrospect clearly was, a warning sign. The pattern was there. Basilar skull fractures. Frontal or near-frontal impacts. The absence of head and neck restraints. But the culture of NASCAR at the time, and perhaps the culture of motorsport more broadly, had a complicated relationship with safety mandates. Drivers valued freedom, control, and personal choice. There was a pervasive attitude that risk was inherent in the sport, and that equipment decisions were ultimately personal. Dale Earnhardt's death, because of who he was, because of his stature in the sport, because of the public grief it generated, broke that attitude open in a way that no previous death had. The autopsy findings, combined with the deaths that had preceded his, made it clear that this was not bad luck. It was a preventable, predictable problem. And NASCAR could no longer look away. In the months following Earnhardt's death, a significant and painful legal battle unfolded in Florida, not just over the cause of the crash, but over access to the autopsy photographs themselves. Several media organizations, including the Orlando Sentinel, filed requests under Florida's public records laws to obtain the autopsy photos. Teresa Earnhardt, Dale's widow, fiercely opposed the release of those images. She argued, compellingly, and with enormous public sympathy, that her husband deserved to be remembered with dignity, and that releasing graphic images of his autopsy served no legitimate public interest. The Florida legislature acted with remarkable speed. Within weeks of Earnhardt's death, the state passed what became informally known as the Earnhardt Family Protection Act, a law that exempted autopsy photographs from public records requirements when the family of the deceased objects to their release. The law was signed by Governor Jeb Bush in May 2001. Teresa Earnhardt did agree to allow a limited review of the autopsy photos by an independent medical expert selected by the Sentinel, under the condition that the photos would not be published. That expert reviewed the images and confirmed that the official findings, the basilar skull fracture as the cause of death, were accurate and consistent with what the autopsy report described. The legal fight was ultimately a reflection of something deeper, the collision between the public's hunger for answers about a very public death and the private grief of a family that had lost a husband and father. Teresa Earnhardt's determination to protect her husband's dignity in death was widely respected, and the law she inspired has since shielded other Florida families from similar situations. Beyond the specific medical findings, the autopsy report and the investigation surrounding Earnhardt's death told a larger story about the state of NASCAR safety at the turn of the millennium. It was a story that the sport needed to hear, even though hearing it was painful. NASCAR in 2001 was in many ways still operating on instincts and traditions that dated back decades. The cars had evolved enormously in terms of speed and power, but the safety systems, the roll cages, the restraints, the cockpit design, had not kept pace with what engineers and biomechanics experts knew was possible. The relationship between speed and safety had always been tense in racing, but the technology to genuinely protect drivers was available. It simply had not been made mandatory. After Earnhardt's death, that began to change dramatically. The hands device mandate was just the beginning. NASCAR also began requiring stronger seat belts and improved installation standards. The sport invested in research into soft walls, foam barrier systems that could absorb impact energy more effectively than concrete, and the safer barrier, steel and foam energy reduction barrier, began appearing at tracks around the circuit. Cockpit designs were re-evaluated. Head restraint systems were improved. These changes didn't happen overnight, and they weren't always smooth. There was resistance from some drivers, some teams, and some corners of the sport's traditionalist culture. But the momentum was unstoppable, because the evidence from Earnhardt's death, laid out plainly in a medical examiner's report, was impossible to dispute. It's easy, when you get into the technical and legal details, to lose sight of the human being at the center of all of this. Dale Earnhardt was not just a 7-time champion or a cultural icon. He was a father, a husband, a man who loved his family and his farm in Morseville, North Carolina. He was a man who had scratched and clawed his way up from poverty to become one of the most recognizable athletes in America. He had just watched his close friend Michael Waltrip win the Daytona 500, driving for his own team. He had watched his son Dale Jr. finish second. By some accounts, in the seconds before the crash, he may have been running interference, protecting his people, doing what he had always done, thinking of others on the racetrack even in those final moments. It's an image that those who knew him find entirely believable. His daughter, Kelly Earnhardt Miller, has spoken over the years about the ongoing work of keeping her father's legacy alive while also processing the grief of losing him so suddenly. Dale Jr. has been remarkably open about how his father's death affected him, including the survivor's guilt and the years he spent struggling to reconcile his grief with the demands of his own racing career. The Earnhardt family's journey through loss has been public and often deeply moving. What the autopsy report ultimately gave the family, in its own clinical way, was clarity. There was no mystery about what happened. There was no ambiguity to haunt them. Dale Earnhardt died quickly, from a catastrophic but instantaneous injury, in the car he loved, doing the thing he had devoted his life to. That is, as grief goes, a form of mercy. More than 2 decades have passed since Dale Earnhardt drove his last lap. The sport he shaped has changed enormously, in no small part because of what happened to him. Drivers who might have died from the same type of injury that killed him have instead walked away from crashes, or been carried away with manageable injuries, because of the safety revolution his death accelerated. In 2004, NASCAR introduced its Generation 4 car with improved safety features. In subsequent years, the car of tomorrow and then the next-gen car continued to incorporate advances in crash energy management, cockpit protection, and restraint technology. Today's NASCAR drivers race in vehicles that, while still fast and still dangerous, offer a level of protection that would have been unimaginable in 2001. The irony, and it is a painful one, is that Earnhardt himself was central to the resistance against these kinds of changes during his lifetime. He was a man who believed in doing things the way they had always been done, who was skeptical of new equipment that changed the feel of driving. It is almost certainly true that he would have eventually come around to the hands device, as most drivers of his era did once they tried it properly. But he never got the chance. His death made other drivers' chances possible. Dale Earnhardt's number 3 was not retired by NASCAR. The sanctioning body does not retire numbers the way other sports do, but no full-time Cup driver has run that number since his death. It remains, by unspoken agreement, a tribute. When you see the 3 in memorial graphics, on decals on fans' cars, on shirts and hats and walls, it carries all of that weight, the championships, the personality, the life cut short, and the changes that life and death set in motion. The autopsy report of Dale Earnhardt Sr. is a clinical document. It describes injuries, measurements, findings. It uses the dry, precise language of forensic medicine. But read in context, read alongside everything we know about who Dale was, about the crashes that preceded his, about the safety devices that existed but weren't mandated, about the sports culture at the turn of the millennium, it becomes something more than a medical record. It becomes a mirror that racing held up to itself. And what the sport saw in that mirror forced it to change. Dale Earnhardt was the Intimidator. He intimidated other drivers, intimidated the record books, intimidated the idea that someone from nothing couldn't become the greatest. But in the end, the most lasting thing he did for NASCAR may not have been the 76 wins or the 7 championships. It may have been the way his death forced the sport to take care of the drivers who came after him. That's a legacy no one would have chosen. But it's a legacy that has saved lives. And in some ways, that's the most Dale Earnhardt thing of all, tough enough to change the sport even from beyond the finish line. If you're watching this and you've never seen Dale Earnhardt race, go find some footage. Watch him work through traffic at Talladega. Watch the way he moved his car like an extension of his own body. Watch the black number 3 disappear into a pack of cars and come out in front. Watch what greatness looked like in a helmet and fire suit on a Sunday afternoon in the American South. Then remember that he was a real man, and that real men are not invincible, and that the sport he gave everything to finally started giving something back, in the form of safety, because of what was lost when he was gone. Thank you for watching. If this story meant something to you, please share it. And if you want to see more deep dives into the history of racing and the stories behind the headlines, subscribe and stick around. We've got plenty more where this came from.